Hello and welcome to my presentation about how I'm going to prepare to interview Cassie. In preparing to interview Cassie, it's been crucial for me to reflect on how my own worldview has impacted the way that I saw her situation and how this has changed after reflecting. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge the Indigenous Australians as the original owners of the land, and in my local area that's the Ku-ring-gai people. Before I meet with her, it's so important for me to remember that I must be respectful of her people and that they are the original owners of the land, and that's just an important headspace for me to be in. This presentation is going to outline the following: that colonisation has shaped how Cassie reacts now, that there is a history between the field of psychology and Indigenous Australians, how my cultural position, white privilege and power may impact my interaction with Cassie and her community, and finally issues and strategies that need to be considered throughout my interview with Cassie. So the colonisation, when the colonisation occurred, the white Europeans migrated to Australia to colonise, which caused interruption to the way of life that the Aboriginal Australians were living and resulted in trauma. The recovery was made difficult by the lack of support and lack of time. Lack of support, they were denied their own way to deal with it and were forced into living life according to how the Europeans wanted them to live. And the lack of time, occurrences kept happening and they were never given time after one incident to recover before the next. So some of these include the land was declared as not owned by anyone, which followed closely by dispossessing Aboriginal people from their land, which followed by trying to civilise Aboriginal Australians, which followed by marginalising non-white Australians, followed by assimilating them into society, then removing children and land rights issues, and so many situations just kept happening time and time again, not allowing recovery. This developed poor coping mechanisms and proper grief was not experienced. Parents and adults were affected and children were witness to this. If a parent, for example, fell to alcohol as a coping mechanism for dealing with hurt and pain, then that's how children were taught. That's how you would deal with pain and grief. And that was passed down from generation to generation. They weren't taught proper coping, or they didn't inherit proper coping mechanisms. This has led to suicide, disappointment, substance abuse, and issues with crime, low academic achievements, and poor health. That's just seeing Cassie's story. Which is where Cassie comes in. So without understanding the context of the colonisation, Cassie's behaviour can be seen as dysfunctional and rebellious. However, understanding that these effects and how they've affected her and her community today, it's crucial to understand her behaviour. And her behaviour is almost completely explainable and understandable when you understand the colonisation. It's had effects on Cassie directly, so she might have had poor parenting or poor older generations around her, which has led from one generation to the next and explained in the previous slide. It's also led to behavioural issues. For example, she's privy to aunts getting feisty and angry. She's had issues with the justice system, feels discouraged and feels like giving up. On her community, they've had low employment rates, low education completion. They're grieving deaths such as Bubba's. There's community breakdown. For example, Cassie's mum wants to send her away to live with her uncle because she recognised that perhaps this community wasn't healthy for a young person, which is breaking down the community because people are getting sent away. These disadvantages have stemmed from the colonisation and passed down from generation to generation, which has caused Aboriginal communities to fall into a low socioeconomic status. It's through this lens that we must view Cassie's scenario, especially before interviewing her. It's important when we do interview her to focus on the future rather than looking back. It's crucial to understand the past and to show a great deal of respect for her past in the interview, but it's also really important to empower her for the future and to remind her that we're working with her and not against her. We aren't able to change the systems that are in place currently or the systems that have been in place in the past, but we can encourage Cassie to pursue what she sees as a glimmer of hope. It's crucial in this process to build on only what Cassie has said through listening clearly so that she feels encouraged and not like we're wanting her to conform to our ways, but rather that she to go along with her suggestions. For example, she suggested getting higher education to become a teacher, so encouraging her and her passions may distract her from her past in crime and focus her attention on something that's more beneficial in helping her move forward. Which brings us to understanding the history between psychology and Indigenous Australians. So before we delve into the aspects the discipline of psychology has had on Indigenous Australians, it's important for us to understand the mindset that a lot of Europeans came to Australia with. So social Darwinism played a huge role in the colonisation. We'll get to that in a second, but it's under the world in the time was shifting from rural to urban life, caused by the Industrial Revolution, and it relied on a lot of black people as a trade. Not saying that this is right, it was just the culture and the way that they viewed it and what they called it. They called them slaves and called them a commodity. Europeans were establishing their empire throughout the world, hence they were coming to Australia. The social Darwinism involves an evolutionary theory, and that was heavily impacted the way that the Europeans saw Australia when they got here. There was a mindset of the survival of the fittest. They thought that the weaker cultures just wouldn't last, and the stronger cultures would outlast them. And it was expected that Western cultures would be this fittest, would be the outlasters. So when they came to Australia, Europeans noticed that the Aboriginal way of life was very prehistoric and primitive, which led to an assumption that they lacked intellectual development. Based on their understanding of their role of darker-skinned people, which was slaves, they assumed that they would outlast the Aboriginal Australians, and so white Europeans asserted their dominance over the Indigenous Australians. It wasn't in an attempt to be barbaric, it was the culture and the assumption of the time just due to their limited knowledge, which explains why the white Australians treated the Aboriginal Australians like they did. They just didn't know better. After World War II, research was almost reignited in the world after a few years of hiatus, and it really took off in psychology, and there started to be a lot more interest into the intellectual ability of Aboriginal Australians. Afterwards, this meant that they, in the 1950s and 1960s, assimilated them into schooling to see how they'd go with the white schooling system. At this time, psychologists knew of the psychological impacts that there would be in taking children away from their parents in order to assimilate them, both long-term and short-term. They, however, still worked with the government to bring about what we now call the stolen generation. And this still hurts today, as psychologists were fully aware of the effects but chose to ignore them. These circumstances of trauma and grief led to truancy and behavioural issues, which affected the academic scores of Aboriginal Australians just due to the fact that they weren't there due to the stress. But the behavioural link to IQ was not made in academic studies. In the 1970s to the 1990s, I saw a huge development of changing the way that standardised tests were played out. There was developments in acknowledging that life circumstances and emotional intelligences was involved in the idea of intelligence, and it impacted that, rather than just emphasising the marks in an exam. So today we're still working on this, and it's definitely still a process. So it's important to know that this will shape the way that I approach interviewing Cassie, because her parents, aunts and uncles were directly affected by the stolen generations, either themselves or the people that they knew. And this trauma would affect the way that they talk, the way that they hold on to bitterness against psychologists and how they talk about psychologists, and their attitudes towards getting help from anyone professional being involved with being a psychologist. So Cassie may well be the very first generation in her family to be given an equal, an opportunity for quality education, but she didn't complete school because she dropped out due to racial slurs. The stereotypes established by psychologists in the past are still lingering in communities today, especially in the way that Aboriginal people are viewed in the education system. And there's some ways to overcome this. It's important to know that my association with being a psychology student holds no weight for Cassie in terms of impressing her or developing rapport. If anything, it hinders it. So she needs to know me as someone who cares, not just as someone who's associated with psychology. Also, to acknowledge that it happened not just 200 years ago, but it's 40 years ago. It's still quite recent. Also to help Cassie be guided into ways that she can overcome stereotypes in the education system. TAFE is a pathway that could help her get higher education. So because she's lost this education opportunity, I need to allow her to grieve the loss of her education, but also provide ways forward and to discuss further with Cassie ways to overcome the adversity that she's faced. It's also important to recognise that as I go to interview Cassie, that I take responsibility for the interaction that I have with her and with her community. When I interview Cassie, I know that I will be the point of contact, which is why it's so important for me to understand my past and upbringing and how that affects my interaction with Cassie and her community, which brings me to discuss my cultural position, white privilege and power. I was born as a white Australian into an area that lacks cultural diversity. I was in a family that had a high economic status, socioeconomic status, that affected my schooling, community, and family. I hadn't ever overly struggled with getting opportunities. I went to a good school in an area that struggle was more rare than it was common. This meant that circumstances didn't have a massive impact on my education, which is a major difference between my assumed upbringing and a lot of the people around me and Cassie. So this was up until the point that my dad got sick in late high school and he ended up passing away when I was 17. This heavily impacted my schooling, but I was still surrounded by people that did not understand loss. During this time, I was dealing with a lot of things, including my dad being diagnosed and having cancer, followed by losing him. I lost friends because they didn't understand. We moved houses. I was doing the HSE, graduating school, fired from my job as I couldn't commit due to family circumstances. So I had lots of changes and stressful situations. So I can definitely understand how one circumstance builds on another and can lead to more stress and more pressure than just the first situation. However, I had access to great support to help me get me through it, which is a major difference between what I went through and what others have. I had sympathy from others in my life, which may be different to what Cassie has experienced, which brings me to how these factors lessened or impacted my situation. Being born into a wealthier family has not only provided me with opportunities many people would be deprived of, but during this hard time, my family could afford medical support for my dad, afford to see quality psychologists to help us emotionally cope with everything. I also had the privilege of going to a private school with caring teachers that had time and energy to support my academic needs. I understand that my socioeconomic position allowed me to cope much better with a horrible situation than someone going through something similar without that power that I had. This is not said to show off, but revealing that I am aware of my status and how it affected me in a tough time, but I'm fully aware of someone going through a similar situation might not have this. Which brings me to how this is going to how my cultural position impacts my interaction with Cassie. I understand that Cassie's community may not provide as much focus, support, and sympathy towards her, as her situation may not necessarily be irregular. So, like mine was quite irregular for the people that I was around. So people had a lot of sympathy and time for me, whereas Cassie may not have this because it could be quite a regular thing that occurs in her environment. It's important for me to be careful of my language and not to relate or try and tell her that I understand because of my experiences, because they're very different. It's also need to be wary not to patronize and to listen more than talking, to be aware of the power that I felt over the years and not take this into the interview, but allow Cassie to feel like she's in control of her situation, which happens by me listening and acknowledging her ideas and thoughts as a power of change, not just my own, so she can be the change that she wants to see. Be opening to hearing Cassie's story from her perspective and paying attention to what she says and what's important to her and what's not. So hearing her story from her perspective. Which finally brings me to issues and strategies that are needed to keep in mind when interviewing Cassie. So some relevant issues that might occur or can often occur is not having knowledge about situations, not having critical reflexivity, and not having the skills required. So these issues are about to be discussed in terms of how can we deal with these issues. There are some strategies that can be involved, and 3 of those strategies would be being respectful, being open and flexible, and being honest, which we're about to discuss. So being respectful, it's respectful to learn about the Aboriginal culture, listen to Cassie and allow her to propose situations rather than me urging my own. Avoiding stereotypes, consulting her and actually asking her questions, and also waiting to be invited, practically in terms of like waiting to be invited to speak and waiting for her to initiate rather than me forcing myself and my opinions on her. Next is to be open and flexible, to understand that we come from different perspectives and that she might have a different perspective on the situation to me, to be compromising practically on a meeting time and place. So putting her in a situation where she's going to be comfortable rather than necessarily me being comfortable, and to not assume anything, to lower those expectations. For example, she might want another friend or close family member to come with her, and to not be shocked by that, but to actually lower my expectations as to what it's going to look like. Finally, being honest, admitting if I don't know something, not promising too much, and being myself. They're just all some practical ways and strategies. How I'm going to implement those is I've made a predetermined decision to analyse those things and how I'm going to implement them. So ways that that's going to happen is I'm going to use reflective listening as a skill that I've learnt, which is reflecting on what she's saying and listening deeply and intently into what she's saying. Be prepared to listen much more than I speak. Not going into meeting Cassie, assuming that I'm going to teach her, but that we're both going to learn. There's no power position. not suggesting or expecting that I will be able to propose a blanket solution, but I'm going to listen to her and work it out with her rather than for her. And to check in and make sure that she's as comfortable as possible practically before meeting her, and reassuring her that it's actually for her, it's not for me. And finally, being prepared to be humble enough to admit if I do not know something or can't fix something. It's okay to be human. So at the end of the day, I've learned lots about all this. I've learned many things. So concluding what we've spoken about, it's been crucial before interviewing Cassie to process her position she's currently in based on the colonisation and how it affects her community today, as well as how the history between the field of psychology and Aboriginal Australians has been negative in the past, and this might taint her perspective today. Also, how my current cultural position may affect the way that I see her before I even meet with her, and that it's really important to neutralise this in order to be the best help I can be to Cassie. And finally, to be aware of the issues that may arise and be super aware of the strategies that I can implement in order to deal with this. And at the end of the day, we'll be able to help Cassie. Thanks.